All right, Anthony, Tony Vaquero. I just turned 78 a couple of days ago.
Okay, well, happy birthday.
Thank you. Didn't know I'd make it this long, this far.
Seems like you're healthy.
Yeah, reasonably so.
Enough.
Well, when I first heard about it, I thought this was a great idea. Let's preserve this history. As you know, Korean War picked up the nickname the Forgotten War, and that's basically true among a lot of the public. So this is something that's going to keep the history alive and anecdotes from veterans and so on. It's a great project.
And that's our goal. I mean, we'd like to bring as much attention to the service that you paid for our country in Korea, over in Korea. Why do you think it's called the Forgotten War?
Well, in the first place, it started on June 25, 50, which just 5 years after World War II. And as someone who was a young kid during World War II, I can remember we were pretty war-weary by the time 1945 came along. So I guess it's only human nature to, it was only 5 years before the other war, and people didn't want to hear too much about it. And unless your family had a son or husband or whatever in Korea or serving at that time, there was not that much interest.
And so that's clearly a stark contrast to nowadays, where I feel like the younger generations, or maybe the media is an aid to that. Everyone's very aware of war and what's going on.
It's incredible that you could even take a cell phone into war and call somebody at home the next day after something occurred over there. It's amazing, the communications. Back then when we were there, we used the old World War II walkie-talkies. Were about this large, and you were lucky if somebody heard you a mile away. Now you've got GPS, you've got all these satellites and so on. It's a different world. Well, actually, it happened, I think, in 1996. That after pressure from Congress and veterans groups, he kind of snuck in the Defense Appropriations Bill in Congress the fact that the Korean police action would henceforth be called the Korean War. So this was about 1996, and it was a good thing. But a lot of people still continue using police action. If you look at the obituaries in the Syracuse Post-Standard, once in a while you'll see he was a veteran of the Korean conflict. Now, believe it or not, I called up a number of the funeral directors in the county, and I said, please start using Korean War. I also contacted the state, I guess there's a state group of funeral directors, and they publish a newsletter, and spoke to a woman there, and I says, how about telling your funeral directors around the state to call it the Korean War? And she said she would, but once in a while that comes back to us, police action, conflict, things like this. Well, to justify our interest into the war, President Truman called it a police action. He didn't have to ask Congress for a declaration of war. He wrote an autobiography years later, and he said one of his regrets is not asking Congress for a declaration and having it known as the Korean War. So.
How do you feel about the fact that it is acknowledged as a war now? What does that mean to you?
Well, the memory for most people is so hazy. Among the general public, I don't think it matters to them whether you call it a conflict, police action, or war. Unless old-timers like us or relatives, most people barely think about it.
It almost seems that nowadays any conflict we have is considered a war anyway. Whenever our soldiers are in some kind of line of battle, whether it's a conflict or police action or a war, there's still that respect that goes out to the soldiers.
Sure.
So maybe it's a little different mentality than...
I think so. After all, we did lose over 34,000 guys during the police, I almost said it myself, Truman's police action. And as John mentioned, prior to my coming on here, 8,000 are still missing in action and over 100,000 wounded. Not to mention the poor Korean civilians. There are estimates that maybe 1 million civilians were killed during that war, caught in the crossfire. And so it was a devastating. Okay, I was 18. I enlisted in the Air Force foolishly thinking that if you joined the Air Force, you're going to fly. I think I'd seen too many World War II movies, and what I wanted to do was get on the airborne duty and become a radio operator or a gunner, or whatever, and I wanted to fly the worst way. But I wanted to be in an airplane. And so I joined, went through basic at Sampson Air Force Base, which is no longer here in Lake Geneva. And near the end of basic training, there was an announcement. Anybody who wants to get into pilot school, report to barracks so-and-so. And so I went in there, and there were guys lined up in the barracks, and doctors came along and examined us. And to this day, I'll still remember this young Air Force doctor saying, "I'm sorry, you won't be able to fly. Pilot, at least." I said, "Why?" So he mentioned something, a physical problem that I never knew I had. It didn't prevent me from going into service or playing sports when I was younger or anything. But I said, "Sir, what does this have to do about flying?" He said, "I'm sorry, son." He patted me on the shoulder. He was kind of humane about it. And he says, "But that's enough to knock you out of flight duty."
So the altitude and the speed just would have taken its toll on your body?
He didn't explain what it would do, but that was it.
So what's that like? I mean, you must have been a little disappointed.
I was devastated. That's why I joined. But later, after basic, I was sent to Keesler Air Force Base, Biloxi, Mississippi, to radio operator school, and where we had to learn Morse code and operating radio equipment. It was a huge school. There were 3 shifts. I mean, you could be midnight to 6, or you could be 3 to 12, and big shifts. They were pumping out radio operators by the thousands. So near the end of that school, they passed along a clipboard, and they said, "Anybody want to be an airborne radio operator?" Now I thought I had it made. So I signed it, and I can still remember the fellow next to me from Pennsylvania says, "I'd enjoy no Air Force to fly." Now, guess who got the flight duty? He did. We were at the same code level. Everything was the same. We're graduating, but that's the way the military goes. So we did 2 or 3 of us did a foolish thing, if you want to hear this.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, we went down to the orderly room, and we wanted to see the first sergeant. Of course, this is a guy who was in World War II, with stripes all over the place, and grizzly. And they said, okay, so we waited a while. 3 of us went in his office. He was behind a desk. And he said, "What do you guys want?" Like a movie, "What do you guys want?" Barking at us. So we were petrified, 18 years old, in front of this guy who'd been through everything. And no one spoke, so finally I blurted it out. "We want to transfer to the Army."
He probably wasn't happy when he heard
I can still recall his grabbing the edge of the desk, the knuckles turning white. Yeah. And he yelled out, "Get the hell out of here." And he literally started running after us, chased us through the orderly room and down the street. We were 18 years old. We could outrun him, fortunately. And there were so many of us in that school that he didn't know who we were. So we made it to the barracks, and that was the end of that. So I never got airborne duty.
Wow.
Close to it, though. When I was stationed in the mountain, in Korea, I was on a 5,000-foot high mountain. And the Pacific Stars and Stripes magazine, I showed Dr. Han this article. It said that this is the highest Air Force outfit in Korea outside of being in an aircraft. So that's as high as I ever got.
Very close.
I was close.
So I guess obviously you never transferred to the Army then?
No, you couldn't do it anyway, but we didn't know.
Yeah,
we didn't know.
You're young.
We didn't know any better.
Yeah.
I went to radio operator school, I think, the end of May in '52. And it was a fairly lengthy school, 5 or 6 months, so I got out of there, I think, in November. Then we had a 30-day leave, and then I got the orders to report to California, Camp Stoneman. And there was a port of debarkation, waiting for the orders. And then we were on a troop ship, the Mitchell, to Korea.
And what was that like? It seemed like you spent a lot of time in preparation to be shipped to Korea, basically.
Right.
But, obviously it's different mentality when you're training versus when you're on your way over there.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, the ship?
The experience going to Korea, maybe the fear of actually seeing battle or anything like that, actually being, in the...
Well, actually, that didn't even, at the time, didn't occur to me. I do remember once we landed went into the port of Yokohama. I can recall in the distance Mount Fujiyama, very impressive. And they put us on a troop railroad train that took hours and hours because we were a low priority to an Air Force base. And I can recall we were being marched to breakfast, chow, one morning, and a group of us, and another group was coming in a different direction. Somehow they knew we were going to Korea. They were just coming back, and they all yelled out, "You'll be sorry."
You'll be sorry. Oh, that's reassuring.
So after a few weeks there, we were loaded on what was then the largest aircraft in the world. It was a C-124 Globemaster. Like a couple of the modern big aircraft, the front of it tilted down, and you can drive in Jeeps and tractor trailers and so on. And they loaded about 125 of us, each side of the fuselage, in 2 layers. And this stays in my mind because we started to take off, and the aircraft wouldn't take off. So they had to pull over, and they worked on a generator or something, got it going again. The second time we started to take off, and an aircraft coming in from Korea crash landed on the runway in front of us. So they had to wait until the runway was cleaned. So we were wondering if we'd ever take off.
This is great.
It's a good start, isn't it? This is a good start. But we flew to Daegu, and then different men scattered according to the orders. I went to Kimpo, just outside Seoul, Kimpo Air Force Base, where they put me to work building bunkers, filling sandbags and bunkers to protect from any aircraft and so on. And then they put me on another aircraft from Kimpo to Gangneung, which is on the East Coast. And after a couple of days there, I was assigned to Detachment 4 of the 608th Aircraft Control and Warning Squadron. So about a 4-hour truck ride going like this all the way to the top of the mountain. And that's where I spent the next probably 8, 9 months, 10 months.
On that top of that mountain?
Yep, as a radio operator.
So it seemed like you kind of got a chance to travel around. I mean, not necessarily a chance, but I mean, you went from place to place at first before you stationed down for...
I didn't get to see too much of Korea. Remember, it was one aircraft to another, one base to another, and then to Gangneung, and then up the mountaintop. So other than a couple of short leaves to Japan, that was it. I didn't see that much of Korea itself. I was telling Dr. Han that I'd never tasted kimchi in my life until the Korean church had an activity for us veterans a few years ago when they put on a buffet, and there was kimchi. It was the first thing I headed for. I loved it.
Like, after all these years, I got to try it.
I got to try it. It was very good, yeah.
So what was it like on the mountain? Was it kind of isolated?
Well, the mountain was very isolated. It was very vulnerable. Luckily, we weren't that close to the action, but we could see the flashes in the sky from harbors on the East Coast being bombed. And we had Morse code. You know what Morse code is? Those dits and dots.
I don't know how to do it, but I know how to do it.
No, we had to learn that. But then for some reason, they shut that down. And my job, along with the other radio operators, was to sit in a radio truck, and it had all kinds of equipment in it, and to monitor, to listen for any aircraft in trouble, maydays, things like this, and then report it back through a speaker system to the radar shack, where they actually had the radar equipment that could see the blips on the screen and so on. So basically that's what I spent until after the war. I was there at the ceasefire, which was July 27, 53. And after the war, in the orderly room on the top of the mountain, there was a clerk. They would call him company clerk, I guess. He either killed himself or accidentally killed himself. We had I shouldn't smile about it, we had it's called a grease gun. It was like a submachine gun. And the rumors were that he had gone to Japan and met a girl, and the girl's family wouldn't permit him to date her and this and that. And we were told he killed himself. I still recall all the commotion in the middle of the night. No helicopter was able to land on that mountaintop. You had to go down, I don't know how many feet, there was a level area. Excuse me, so they came in the next morning, with a huge helicopter, removed his body. Now, because I was a radio operator and I knew how to type, you have to learn how to type in radio operator school, I was taken out of the radio truck and put in the orderly room. So that's how I spent the last 3 months or so in Korea. Yeah. Well, one kind of sad part about it is one day our equipment went down, and we had time on our hands. So 3 or 4 of us took our rifles and decided to take a walk, take a hike. Which in the end we were told were stupid because there's still landmines, trip flares, all kinds of stuff, ordnance out there. We walked a lot of times through hip-deep snow from one ridge to another, but always keeping our sight in the background. We didn't want to get lost. Yeah. And we came upon a top of a ridge that had been heavily napalmed. You know what napalm is? Yeah, so it was very scarred and burned up. And came along and I found sneakers all over the place. They were like mustard-colored canvas sneakers. So I tapped a couple of them, and human remains, bones, came out of the sneakers. And we walked around some more and came across skulls. In fact, I took some pictures I gave it to Dr. Hahn. I said, do you want with these? Whether you want to post these on the site or not, it's kind of grisly, but I put them on top of a boulder and just took photographs. Too bad I didn't have a shovel. It should have been buried. And there were no doubt Chinese soldiers. For the most part, they wore the canvas shoes. But that's something I won't forget.
Yeah, that's quite an experience.
The aftermath of battle. A year later, a few months later, I don't know.
The fact that you saw...
Well, it's not always as a distance. You mean during the actual battles, actual fighting? Mm-hmm. No, we have one man in my outfit, Army guy, who was in his foxhole, and a Chinese soldier jumped in the foxhole and tried to bayonet him. In fact, I saw a scar on his arm years ago, and I said, what's that from? He says, well, this Chinese soldier tried to bayonet me. Mm-hmm. But obviously, he was able to kill the soldier. So it was hand-to-hand in many of these.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think that was maybe the most difficult part of the battle, just seeing death and destruction? And maybe that was a hard realization, I don't know.
Well, it has to something that stays in your mind, yeah. That's for sure. Now, our site had trenches and foxholes around the perimeter. Every once in a while, we'd have to call, they'd call a red alert. So we'd have to get our rifles. And if we weren't in the radio trucks, you'd have to go to pre-assigned places along the perimeter. Mm-hmm. That was scary enough. Yeah. Excuse me.
So did you, while you were over there, did you get a chance to interact with any Koreans, soldiers, or...
No, I did take a picture of one Korean soldier about halfway down the mountain. There was a small amount of soldiers there, Koreans, but I never interacted. No.
And how about foreign troops from other allied countries?
Believe it or not, the only foreign troops I saw were a couple of English Tommies waiting to take an aircraft to Japan. Somebody said, let's go watch a movie. This is in Seoul, all bombed out. Right. So we went into a movie theater, and in front of us were a couple of Tommies, and I got a kick out of their dialects, their accent. Yeah. This was a theater that had no roof on it. It had all been bombed out. And,
but the theater's still operating.
They're still operating. And the seats, I still remember this, the seats were made for Korean civilians, so much smaller. Yeah. So, yeah. But I never, don't forget, I was on that isolated mountaintop. I didn't meet too many people.
So it must have been great to actually, did you get a chance to talk to the English soldiers? Or
no, I regret that now. I should have said something to them just for the heck of it, yeah. But I never did. Yeah, too bad.
It's all right. So have you had a chance to go back to Korea?
Now that's a story. The South Korean government sponsors returns for soldiers or anybody who fought in Korea or served in Korea. I think they call it the return program. And they'll pay the expenses in the hotel and meals and take you sightseeing. Great. So I signed up for it. My wife and I gave them a $500 deposit. We got a notice. We were the next group to go. This would be in the fall, maybe 6-7 years ago. Unfortunately, that's the time that North Korea took to lob some missiles over Japan. They were testing missiles, made all the papers, missiles flying over Japan. My wife's relatives began to call. You've got to be crazy to go back to Korea. That war's going to start again. How can you possibly even think about that? And she wore me down, my wife, you know how women are. And I finally had to ask for the $500 back, and we never went. I really regret that.
Is there any chance that you might go back?
I don't think so. I don't think she's going to change her mind. Now we're older, but I don't think she'll change her mind. I just wanted to see the modern Korea. Because when I was there, what I saw was devastation. You know, buildings that are just torn to pieces.
Movie theaters with no roof?
Pardon?
Movie theaters with no roof on them.
Well, then now what? Super highways, skyscrapers. It's a beautiful country.
Yeah. What have you heard from stories, just that it's so modern? And
well, we have a number of guys who did go and came back. Norm Champagne, you interviewed, and Bruce Ackerman. I think they came back last fall. And they were really impressed with modern-day Korea.
So how do you feel about that, the fact that it's so modern 50 years later?
Well, that's a testament to the Korean people. Hardworking, industrious, intelligent people. Yeah, well, more power to them. Our number one ally in that area. Now, when I was there, of course, Syngman Rhee was the so-called president. He was more a dictator than a president. And the South Koreans had to go through a number of governments before they finally got what we would call a democracy. So I regret not going back.
So how do you feel about the American role then in Korean, I guess, obviously the war, but then the development afterwards? And what do you think the American influence is?
Well, every penny spent on South Korea was worthwhile. Worthwhile. And I hate to put it in terms of lives, because so many were killed, but it was something we had to do and we should have done. We should have helped Korea.
How do you think that is in contrast to North Korea?
Well, there you've got the son of the dictator who's in charge when I was there. That real deep communist mindset. People have starved in North Korea. They're going hungry. Most of the food goes to their military to keep him in power. There was a special on North Korea on one of the major networks a few years ago, not that long ago, where they went into North Korea. Streets are almost vacant, very little traffic, very little. And you notice that the people don't smile. They just don't smile. They have nothing to smile about, let's face it. So it's a very oppressive dictatorship. And it seems like it's going to go on for quite a while. Well, let's face it, the North Koreans under Kim Il-sung, the father, were very tied closely to the Chinese, the Red Chinese, and at the time, Joseph Stalin, the ruler of the Soviet Union. And he actually took a trip a couple of times to Moscow to meet with Zhou Enlai and with Mao Zedong and all these people and asked their support. He always had the mindset that the two Koreas should be joined, unified. And he told Stalin, and he also told Mao Zedong, that's the original dictator, that the South Koreans, upon the invasion, and this is documented, would rise up and join the North Koreans. He also said that the Americans, there weren't many in there, but the Americans, by the time they entered, if they did, it would be too late. He'd have all of South Korea occupied with the help of the South Koreans. Of course, none of that came true. But a big mistake was made at the end of World War II, when the two Koreas were created. The American military gave the job to a couple of officers, and they said, where would you divide North and South Korea? Soviet troops were in North Korea. And he just arbitrarily said the 38th parallel seems to do it. But the parallel doesn't geographically divide North and South Korea. You've got rivers and valleys and so on. And the decision was, well, the Russians are in there, well, you know, nothing we can do about it. Well, the Russians didn't waste any time. They began training the North Korean army, gave them weapons, tanks, things like this. In a way, it was almost inevitable when you had that dictator in there. And as I said, they didn't fear us because they thought we wouldn't get into it, or if we did, it would be too late.
Yeah. And the rest is history.
The rest is history. Yeah.
So do you think there's any potential for reunification? Or?
Well, not until the present rulers die off in North Korea. I guess he's designated his son, Kim Jong-il, is it now, his son, to take over after he dies, but I don't know, it's sad, but I don't see any prospect of them being united. I think I left Korea in the late November, early December, and a troop ship called the Gaffney landed in Seattle, Washington. On the way over was the Mitchell. We went under the Golden Gate. That was a nice thing to see. I'd heard so many years about the Golden Gate, and there it was. But I had a 30-day leave coming, so I went home. And my orders then called for me, because I had 2 years left on my enlistment, to report to Pope Air Force Base, which was Fort Bragg, paratrooper school in North Carolina. And I was there maybe a couple weeks, and then I was finally stationed or assigned to Robins Air Force Base in Georgia. Very large Air Force base. So I spent the last 2 years of my enlistment there.
And what were you doing on the base?
Well, I'll tell you, another situation where we were lined up, maybe 6 or 8 of us had just shipped in outside the barracks, and another master sergeant comes out, another first sergeant with all the stripes, and he said, which of you guys knows how to type? Well, I kept quiet. They all kept quiet. So you guys wait here. He went in the order room, came out with his order with our records, right? And he started looking at these, and he says, "Who's Vaquero?" He had me. He had me. I said, "Me, Sarge." He said, "Vaquero, you were a radio operator, weren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, Sarge." "That means you can type, can't you?" So I spent the last 2 years working in the orderly room. Most people would say they'd love the job, but I wanted to do something other than just type reports and so on. And that's how I spent my last 2 years.
Well, I guess at least you're in a little less isolation on the top of the mountain.
I know. Yeah, we were south of Macon, Georgia. You know, small city in Georgia. It was all right. I could tolerate the weather. It's strange. I took basic training, as I said, at Sampson in the winter and froze. And then they sent me to Biloxi, Mississippi, where the temperatures were in the 80s and 90s, and the humidity would knock you over. Then I went to Korea, where I froze again. And then they sent me to Georgia, where I was in the heat again.
They want to keep you on your toes.
Yeah, I guess so.
How was that living on the base in contrast to being in Korea for about a year?
Well, let's face it, living on a base is another world other than being on that 2-acre mountaintop. You know, the food was better. In Korea, I just ate powdered milk, powdered eggs, sea rations. Now you're on a base. You're called permanent party. You're allowed to leave the base at night if you want to and come back. And you had the chow was better, as I said. You had a PX, commissary, all the conveniences. So it was a different life.
And so, how was your transition from living on the base to civilian life when you were discharged?
Okay, when I was discharged February 28th, 56, back to Salve, a village near us, Salve, New York, and back to a factory work, which I hated. I worked in an assembly, or not an assembly line, a milling machine, which meant you put a piece of something in this machine, and it carved out grooves in it, and another machine over here. So you spent the day doing this, not physically taxing or demanding, but boring. Yeah. Oh, gee, I was so bored. Yeah. So I decided to take advantage of the GI Bill. I went to Syracuse U in fall of 60, I'm sorry, 56, graduated in 60, and got a job teaching in the Syracuse school system.
That's great.
Then I went, took some more courses, got a master's from Syracuse U. And later on I was talked into going into administration. So I became a vice principal of the Syracuse schools, and I retired there in '88. When I got married, I think it went all the way up to like, let's say maybe $80 or $90 a month. Then my wife had a baby when I was going on my senior year, and we got all of $110, $115. So it wasn't that much, but it helped.
Yeah. And so how do you think your experience in Korea impacted your life?
I'll tell you, for a guy from a small village, Salvi, who hadn't seen the world, it taught me a lot about human nature. You learned that there were people to avoid and people to get along with and make friends with. And another culture. When I was in high school, we had a great social studies department. And we learned about a place called Chosun, which is modern-day Korea, right? So when the war broke out, we knew where Korea was. We knew where Chosun was, unlike a lot of people. And I can recall, it broke out in June. September, we came in for the last half of our senior year. Our social studies teacher saying, "I feel sorry for you boys." Well, shortly after that, the Incheon landing took place, and we broke out of the Pusan perimeter and were rushing northward, and General MacArthur issued his famous statement, "We'll be home by Christmas." So we kind of shrugged it off when she said, "I feel sorry for you boys. You know, the war is over practically." We found out later when the Chinese poured in with a couple 100,000 troops or whatever that the war was not over. We knew we'd be drafted, and that's when I decided I wanted to fly, and the rest is history.
She knew something no one else did. Why do you think there was so much? I mean, you mentioned people were tired of the war, but I mean, a lot of people didn't know where Korea was.
No idea.
Yeah.
Even after the war, I was home on that 30-day leave, come to think of it. And a friend of mine said, "Let's go get a beer. There's a place in Salvi." So I went in with him, and the bartender looked at me and says, "I need your ID." So my friend got a little upset with him. "For God's sakes," I forgot his name now, Jim. He said, "He just got back from Korea. He's old enough to drink." This guy, to this day I remember it, his eyes seemed to glaze over. This was just after the war. "Oh, Korea. Oh, yeah." So I remember he didn't stay too long with this guy, at least. Yeah.
So he didn't know what was going on.
No. The 50s were good times in this country. The economics, the economy were very good, and people were making money, working.
So you didn't want to worry about...
Who wanted to think about the Korean War?
Uh-huh.
Except if you had family over there, yeah.
And so you mentioned learning about different cultures. Is that why you think you went into education? Because you wanted to, I guess, facilitate
I guess partially because I wanted to teach social studies, which involved different countries and so on. It always interested me. Yeah. And when I got to Korea, I regret that I didn't see that much because I was usually on a truck going up the mountain, if I went anywhere, and coming back down. But I could see the Korean people where they lived. I could see them along the side of the road. You know, they were in bad shape. I felt sorry for them. But again, very industrious, hardworking. I admired them. Well, believe it or not, I met my wife in kindergarten. 5-year-olds. However, we never dated. And after high school graduation, we didn't see each other. But I was going to Syracuse University, and I didn't have a car. I was on a bus coming back from classes one night, and I saw somebody sitting on the bus that seemed vaguely familiar to me. So I asked her, and sure enough, it was my wife, my future wife, Ann. We started dating, and then...
So did you get a chance to share your experiences with her and your family?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, she was worried about the CDs I brought in today. I said, "I'll get them back. I'll get them back."
Good. Well, that's good that you were able to, share your experiences. And...
Yeah, she was perfectly willing to go to Korea until those missiles came over, and that did it.
So what, I guess you mentioned, education and getting to know about other people. What else, and I guess your life in the military has influenced your life? How has your perspectives changed?
Concerning
just life in general, I guess, how people interact.
Oh, in a way that's tough to answer. It's, as I said, I saw different sides of human nature in the military in the 4 years. I think I grew to having more of an appreciation of this country too, by going in the military, and not to take things for granted. So it affected me.
Do you think that appreciation of the military has changed over the generations?
I think so. Thank God for the young people who volunteer today. I've always felt, you may not want to hear this, that there should have been a draft. Truman wanted to have a draft, 18 months, compulsory military training. Never passed in Congress. With your exception, of course, I feel too many of these young guys today are wild. Can't take orders. They've got to go in the military and learn to get up at a certain time, follow orders, do what you're told, and just calm down and be a human being. So there's a different mindset today. Some of the things I see these young guys doing today would be enough to get you hung in my day. They're outrageous things. I think it'd be a good thing.
So the military would teach that discipline.
Oh, yeah. Or else the brig or Fort Leavenworth.
The consequences.
Yep, court-martial or something, but I think it's needed. Yeah. Never occurred to me, actually. I do know that, let's face it, the Korean War was the first war, hot war against communism. It's important because it did show the Red Chinese and the Soviets that we would resist, that there was a line that they could come up to, but they couldn't cross. So, as I said, I think it's important to remember that.
Yeah. Okay. And for those future generations of children and family members that will be checking out the project and the database and doing research on the Korean War, finding out that it is in fact a war and not police action, do you have a specific message that maybe you'd like to?
Well, again, who was the diplomat, famous diplomat who said war is a failure of diplomacy, right? Which is true. And there are so-called wars that are just and so-called wars that are unjust, where we shouldn't be poking our noses. I won't mention modern days, but
feel free to.
Might be one or two there. I always felt that Afghanistan going after bin Laden made sense. I was very queasy about going into Iraq. I had an interview with Richard Case, Dick Case of the Post-Standard. You see his columns occasionally. A few years ago, at the time, the war hadn't started, but we were mobilizing to go into Iraq. And he called me and asked me the question, what do you think about this? And I said, there's no question in my mind we'll win, but I worry about the aftermath. And that's the thing that haunts us every time we get into other engagements around the world, the aftermath.
Well, that's what a lot of people talk about, exit strategy. And not just getting out of the war, but what's going to happen to that country once. Well,
look, an example of Egypt. There's another old saying, you're better dealing with the devil you know than the devil you don't know. Mubarak was a dictator, there's no question about it. But what's going to happen now? Are those extremist groups going to take control of Egypt? You just don't know. You open up a can of worms or do things like this.
So you would say then that the most important part is to actually try to avoid war at all costs, try to solve any kind of conflict through diplomatic solutions.
Right, right. Or the last resort, right.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good final message to that interview.
Very good.
Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. I appreciate taking the time.